I mean, sometimes it's just straight up comedy. I mean, as is much documented and discussed in scholarship on Euripides and Aristophanes, we know there was this very, very close professional dramatic relationship between the great comedian Aristophanes and Euripides, and in a way they were constantly riffing off each other throughout their careers. Aristophanes, of course, constantly borrows bits of elements of plot from Euripides and makes them even funnier because they're in comedy, but he's also using elements which are comic elements, comic tones that are already there in the bits of Euripides that he's borrowing. And then there's borrowing vice versa, with Euripides also responding to Aristophanes. I mean, it seems to me, just from the three tragedians who survived, of whom we only have a tiny proportion of their work, I think we always just have to remember how little tragedy we have. So can we make generalizations about how serious or not serious was it? We only have a tiny fraction of it. Maybe some of the missing Sophocles, of which we only have like 5%, was hilarious. Maybe we have the most serious bits of Sophocles. It seems to me that from the plays and fragments we have, Euripides is by far the funniest. I mean, by far the most interested in like social misunderstanding and sort of black comedy. It's often black, like on the edge of being black comedy. I mean, so for instance, in this play, he adds in the wonderful character of the peasant, so that the unmarried daughter of the murdered Agamemnon has this husband, and then there's a lot of, in a way, jokey meditation on like how awful it is to be married to this dirty common person if she's supposed to be a princess. And it's both joking about the weird social comedy of having to entertain in a house where you just don't have anything nice to wear and no pretty dresses, but then also, I mean, it seems to be constantly joking also on Electra's snobbery, and that the comedy is sometimes it's pun kind of comedy, where Euripides can riff on words and pun with language. Sometimes it's social comedy. Sometimes it's comedy that's based on one character doesn't understand something that another character does. So most famously in this play, each of the three excellent tragedians wrote a recognition scene between the siblings, Orestes and Electra. And in this play, Euripides is doing something very similar to what Aristophanes, the comedian, does in comedy, of taking a great scene from Aeschylus and doing a version which shows how stupid is that, and which sort of shows up all the elements that make this plot in this tragedy completely implausible, where the characters are sort of explicitly saying, shall we recognize each other by the same means as was there in Aeschylus? No, because in fact, brothers and sisters often have different shoe sizes, so that's not going to work. It's stupid. I think it's hard to see that as anything other than, on some level, funny. I mean, I don't think it's sort of putting anything into the play to say that's clearly a funny scene. I mean, I think there are plenty of lines which I hear in the Greek as borderline laugh out loud funny, and I sort of tried to bring out elements of that. I mean, just sort of laugh out loud funny that has to do with class. I'm thinking about when, for instance, when Orestes and Electra are first talking, and Electra is whining about having to be married to somebody who's lower class, and she says, "I'm married, it's like death." And I think it's just such a good one-liner, because yes, marriage can be like death, but it's also so hyperbolic and over the top that we're laughing at her as well as laughing at the situation.
Just on that note, because you've mentioned that the play was the myth actually was treated by the other dramatists as well. So on the note of sort of the allusions to other texts and other plays and other other sort of lurking intertextual presences in Euripides' Electra, how did you manage those? How did you manage the intertextuality of the text of Euripides' Electra?
Yeah, I mean, that's an element which is so clear in this text. I mean, it's so clear that this play is very explicitly looking back to the Aristeia by Aeschylus, and looking back to the way Aeschylus manages this story of siblings, of a wife killing her husband, of matricide, and looking back to that plot and then both mocking it, riffing on it, doing different things with it that make it relevant for the late 5th century context and also make it funny as well as dark. So there's that, but then there's also layered in with allusions to Aeschylus. There's constantly also, as there is in so many Athenian tragedies, but I think in this one, maybe more than some, allusions to Homer, and that it's also a homecoming scene in which the suitor is going to get slaughtered. And Orestes is both Telemachus, he's the son who's going to avenge the father, and he's also Odysseus, who's going to try and sort of slaughter the suitors. And in a way, the play is sort of experimenting with, what if Odysseus and Penelope plot together to kill the suitors? What if they do it both by craft, as Odysseus does? He's going to be in disguise, and then all of a sudden he's openly out there, but then it's also going to be open violence. So he's sort of experimenting with how could each of those texts go differently, and how can I fuse them together? In the recognition scene, the way that Orestes finally gets recognized is a sort of riff on the recognition of Odysseus by his scar. So Orestes in this play also gets recognized by a scar. So it's playing around with both Aeschylus and at the same time with Odyssey Book 19. So I was conscious, as a translator, I wanted to make sure that the language felt elusive and felt literary as well as jokey some of the time, and that there was a sort of fluency about the tone that also suggested this is an English which might be borrowing sometimes from earlier poetry or earlier drama. So one thing I sort of tried to do was sew in little fragments of half quotations from Shakespeare at various moments in the play, as a way of sort of giving a texture to the language that might be sort of similar to how Euripides is constantly looking back to these earlier dramatic and poetic models. So I mean, I was just looking up, so for instance, when Orestes in my translation says, there's no art to tell a decent man, I sort of want the listener to kind of hear, there's no art to tell the mind's construction in the face. It's like Macbeth. Or when he says, I've seen hunger in a rich man's mind, I saw Othello's visage in his mind. And then later on in the play, when there's this sort of there's a terrible realization that the siblings have killed their own mother and actually it doesn't feel good at all, that I sort of borrowed the phrase a little more than kin and less than kind from Hamlet, where it's sort of a sense of what's the son's relationship with the father and how does he feel about that. That's kind of complicated in making Electra talk about the unkind kin of her mother. So that I wanted to have a sense, which is something which I very much didn't want in translating Homer. I wanted with Euripides to have a sense of, it's chatty, conversational sometimes, it has this fluency of tone, and it also has a sense of, there's a vast range of literature behind it, which I wanted to feel different. I didn't want to have that feeling with Homer, because of course there isn't literature behind Homer. There's an oral tradition, but it's not literary in that way. So that's one of the ways I wanted the texture of the verse to feel a little bit different with Euripides versus Homer.
Yeah, and that's actually one of the questions that the students had as well. So how the translation was different from, or actually the text itself was different from, how was the experience of translating tragedy different from translating epic? And if you could talk a little bit more about what the difference in approach might be there. Yeah,
so I mean, I guess one thing is what I've already said, of just, I did want it to feel that this is a language which might have some quotes in it. And also I wanted it to feel a little bit chattier. I mean, one notch closer to real conversation than the way I try to do Homer. So for instance, just on a kind of, in a way, boringly technical level, with my Homer translations, I don't do any elisions. So I always have, I do not think so, not I don't think so. Whereas with Euripides, I wanted to have a sense that this is always metrical verse, but the rhythms of real speech are getting into the metrical verse. And I thought if I have more contractions and people actually say, I don't think so, then it sounds more as if these could be almost real characters speaking, even though they happen to be speaking in meter all the time. I mean, I guess also just the fact that there are multiple meters in tragedy makes it very different. And I sort of wanted to make sure that it's audible when the meter changes. So but I think it's very important in this play that the final sequence of the play is in anapaests, and the whole mood changes once that rhythm becomes sort of more tense, and it's da-dum-dum-dum, you know, that you've got this sense of some terrible movement is happening and people are getting marched off to places they might not want to go. The shift in linguistic rhythm, I think, is important for that. I mean, maybe one thing just to say about the epic versus tragedy. I mean, I did those Seneca translations, which I definitely didn't want to sound nearly as funny or not funny in quite the same way as Euripides. I've also done a translation of Oedipus Tyrannus by Sophocles, and I sort of didn't want that to be nearly as chatty as my Euripides work was. I mean, I wanted to have a sense when I was doing the Sophocles that there's this real denseness to the language and that there's constantly mixed metaphors. Whereas I wanted a kind of clarity in the Euripides verse that I think is quite, I mean, I think the Greek is quite different in terms of how many, you know, metaphors per line are there in Sophocles versus Euripides. Euripides is clearly much closer to actual speech, even if it's not actually, it's obviously it's marked verse, but it's closer to real speech.
Yeah, and more on what you were just saying about meter and about the rhythm, and giving a specific rhythm to specific scenes. That's also one of the things that the students found really interesting to work with, the meter, the different meters in your translation, and how they noticed that you were quite keen on reproducing certain patterns and certain rhythms in the music. And was that a choice? And if it was a choice, as I think it was, how did you change it between choral odes and episodes? And
yeah, I mean, I wish I'd managed to, I mean, I wish I felt it was possible, which I don't think it fully is, to completely replicate the rhythms of a Greek choral ode. I don't think, I mean, people have experimented with that. I think it's a super interesting thing. I mean, I for the choral odes, I do mixed length lines and I experiment with different rhythms. I want it to sound very markedly different from the dialogue passages. And I also want the choral odes to sound very different from the anapaests at the end. But beyond that, I don't feel that I can fully do this strophe is totally going to match that antistrophe. But I certainly want there to be a sense that that the mood changes really quite starkly between different passages in this play, which of course is something that tragedy does in general, and that Euripides is a master of changing the mood. That you can think this is really quite funny, and it's like social comedy. It's almost like the new comedy of Menander in the next century. We're noticing how he's riffing on this other recognition scene. It's funny, and then the chorus comes, and we're in the world of myth, and it's something completely different. You have this completely different perspective, and it's not just about the chorus is talking about something different, but it's also that the sound of the language has to feel very different between these different scenes. And presumably the students aren't singing, right? They're not going to launch into song when it's the chorus. But I mean, I wanted to be a sense that even if you don't sing, you can still hear that it's different.
Yeah, they definitely did hear a difference between the episodes and the choral odes, and that's why the question came up, because they were trying. And also this was a question that came up during one of the episodes that we had with a music expert, with the music director of the play, and he was asking specifically about what to do with music in a Greek tragedy production, and he was saying that he did find it really interesting that in your translation there were different rhythms to work with, and that really sort of worked really well with producing a new music. Producing a new
I wish I could hear it. I'm so sad I can't come to the show. Yeah.
Yeah. So it was, the last question that they had was about gender, and particularly the strange gender dynamics between the two siblings, which is particularly evident in the recognition scene, but also in other bits and pieces of the play. So can you tell us a little bit more about how you approached that as a translator?
Mm-hmm. Yes, I think this play is fascinating. I mean, all of the Orestes story plays, I mean, the Coryphary and the Sophocles Electra and the Euripides Electra, all of them are so interesting about gender, because each of them is sort of engaged with this story that's treated as being about the relationship of nurture to nature. And then the question arising of, is gender something that's natural, or is it something that's created by culture? Is there a particular way that a woman should be, or that a man should be? And of course, in the Aeschylus version of in the Aeschylus Agamemnon, Clytemnestra is presented as a woman who's failing to perform the proper role of being a woman. She's a masculine woman. She's performing the role of a man by being the leader. And then this is sort of question about what happens when a woman usurps the role of a man, and what happens when the man is failing to assert his dominance as a man. So I think Euripides is certainly playing with all those tropes, and Electra in the Euripides version at several points criticizes Aegisthus for failing to be the right kind of man, for being a Parthenikos man, that he's like a girl, there's something wrong about his gender identity, and insists that there's something improper about the way her mother is performing gender as well. But I think there's also something interesting about how in Electra's critique of her mother, she's also seems to suggest either she's too masculine or she's too feminine. Maybe she's wearing too many pretty clothes. Maybe it's not that she's flipped her genders around, but that she's too good at being a woman, and that might include being scheming and clever and managing to fool everybody into thinking you're gorgeous, and getting control of money and resources and accessories, which is potentially figured as feminine. I wanted in particular to bring out how weird and interesting the gender, the presentation of gender is, and how, I mean, Electra herself is the one who seems most clearly to insist on Aegisthus is wrong not to be the proper kind of man, and yet Electra herself seems to be okay with being like a man herself, and that she's actually in some ways doing the same thing that her mother did in the Aeschylus version of being the tough person in the partnership, the one who's going to wield the weapon herself. Aeschylus's Clytemnestra is the one who wields the axe to kill her husband. In this play, Electra wields the weapon and stabs her mother. And so she's, you could say, violating the norms of gender. I also think, just in picking up what I said before about how this is a play which is so interesting and interested in nurture and nature, and one piece of that is whether gender is natural or not. I think the recognition scene is so interesting in its weird language about what makes somebody a woman or a man, and then related to that, how is a brother and a sister, could they actually be exactly the same physically, which is what seems to be implied by the Aeschylus scene, which suggests a brother and a sister have exactly the same hair and exactly the same feet. And Euripides' version seems to both say that's ridiculous, because of course people vary in their hair and their feet, but it seems also to just to completely point that towards, are a woman's hair and a woman's feet exactly the same as a man's hair and a man's feet? If they're not, why not? Is that because of something that is innate, or is that something which is caused by behavior? And can you choose to make your hair girly hair or not girly hair? Is it because of whether you've walked as a woman that your feet are a particular size? Which seems like a stupid question, but it seems actually to be at stake in the scene. So maybe I'll just read the little passage of that. So this is my translation. How can you expect the locks to match? Blue-blooded men teach roughness to their hair by wrestling. Female hairs acquired by combing. Which, I mean, how can you possibly say that your hair gets more female because you've brushed it? And yet that seems to be what the Greek is saying. So I very much wanted my English not to sort of erase that weirdness, but to have it be audible or legible to the user of my translation, that there's something really peculiar going on in whether or not in this plays, and interesting in this plays, thinking about, you know, what is gender after all, and is it something that comes into being the more you perform it?
Yeah, it's really interesting what you said about the similarities, about sort of Euripides playing on the identity, perhaps identity of the two characters of Orestes and Electra. So I don't know if you've seen the poster that the students did
Yeah,
for
yes,
this lecture. But
yeah.
I think it quite nice to reproduces the idea. So they're both in a womb, and
yes,
they look like
yeah.
each other, and
Yes.
they are together, and they are so it's
they're twins and they're these parallel characters. Yes.
Yeah,
and they can't commit these murders without each other. They have to work together. Yes.
Yeah, exactly. And it was quite interesting because today we did a workshop with school students, and they were saying how they could also look like Clytemnestra and Electra. So I think it's as a play which is on hinges on sort of family family affairs and family revenge. I think that's quite interesting. Also, in a way, as you were saying, how Electra, in a way, sort of is reproducing what Clytemnestra was doing in the Oresteia.
Absolutely, yes. So obviously, family resemblances and reproduction are at stake in the play, and in order to destroy her mother, she has to become her, and there's no way to get rid of the mother in the cells. Yes.
Yeah. Now I know we don't have much time, but we do have about 25 minutes. So if you want to drop your questions in the chat, you're more than welcome to do so. And yeah, so you've been projected in
That's lovely.
in the green room with the cast members. Actually, one question that I think that might be a very long question and might require a very long answer, so feel free not to. But I read that one of the things that you're working on is a book on translation called Faithful. So I wanted to ask why the title, because that's literally one of the things that I mean, as a classicist and as a translator, you might want to push back on being faithful.
Yes, I mean, so right now I have that project kind of bracketed because I need to finish the Iliad first. So it's sort of on the back burner. But so the reason the reason I think I'm going with that title is that part of the point of the book is to discuss those metaphors, which are so often both sexualized metaphors, gendered metaphors, but then potentially also just metaphors that have to do with whether translators are inherently tricksters or tricking us. What is it to tell the truth if you're a translator? Because you're always coming up with these words which, in fact, I made up all the words in this translation, and yet I say it's by Euripides. How can that possibly be? How can I not be a liar? How can I be faithful? And if I am being faithful, what am I being faithful to? So part of what I wanted to get at is, I mean, the primary thrust of the book is to do with the particular ways that people think about translations from canonical dead languages, especially from ancient Greek and Latin, and how I think those preconceptions about what a faithful translation is. I think we have much more idea that a translation from ancient languages should be like the kind of translation we make students do in the classroom, like in beginning Latin class, where you prove that you've understood the original by producing this terrible clunky translation, which in fact, stylistically, isn't faithful at all. And yet we say that's the faithful one. And then the one that only recognizes something syntactical and semantic and will be completely unfaithful to every other element of the text. So I sort of part of the point of the project is to try and get at what's the history of that particular set of preconceptions, and why is that set of preconceptions so much more endemic in discussions of ancient languages versus discussions of translations of contemporary fiction or contemporary poetry. I don't think I mean, if you read reviews of contemporary novels, people don't say in nearly that same way, this translation dealt wrongly with this particular word from the Arabic, because this is how the sentence structure works in that instance. And it's partly because, of course, there are different norms for retranslation versus versus translation for the first time, but it's also, I think, to do with the pedagogy within classics about the particular place of translation as a praxis in the classroom, and how that actually, I think, distorts both our ideas about linguistic fluency. Like, what is it to learn Latin? It's not, learning Latin is not the same as translating Latin. Learning Latin is learning how to read Latin. So that's part of what I want to get at as well, is just what's going on with the classics classroom that then has an impact in what people think translation is, and of these particular kinds of texts. So that's, yeah, anyway.
I love it. I find it so interesting, the read and translate sort of similarity and differences. So you read Latin and then you translate Latin. That's two different things, two different acts, and more often than not, we are asked to translate in a way that would be reading, in fact.
Right. I mean, I think it would be much better if we much more often said we got rid of that usage of the word translate. Because I mean, if you're teaching people French, you don't say that, right? You don't say you're learning to translate Proust if you're doing first year French. In fact, you're not learning to translate Proust. You're learning perhaps to read Camus by the time you get to the second year. So that's different. Yeah. So because there's an idea that you can get to an immersive comprehension level where you're not sort of constantly having to say, philos, that means dear kin family, and just be always writing the English over the Greek in your mind. I mean, ideally you don't do that. Ideally you're just immersed in the Greek, and then it will be a separate stage to change to something English.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I'm looking forward to reading it then. We've got, so you mentioned your translation of the Iliad, so we've got one question about how that is going and what's the date for publishing.
Gotta hurry up. Yes, I shouldn't be here talking to you. I should be translating. It's supposed to come out next year. I'm not sure what the exact date is, but next year sometime. I still have a good chunk to finish, so I'm going to be busy over the next few months finishing it up. It's such a fun, gripping project. I felt like, I mean, this happened with the Odyssey as well, but for the first couple of years, I just felt so stuck and I wasn't sure exactly what my vision was, but now I'm on a roll and I feel like I know what I'm doing.
Amazing, amazing. So much to look forward to. And then another one is asking about what has been your main criteria for choosing the works that you translate. So is it personal interest or feeling that sort of pushed you to find specific plays?
I'd say both of those things, and also the third, which is someone hiring me. So in the case, when I was like a graduate student, I never thought I'm going to be a translator. I knew I was interested in literary criticism and cultural history and a whole range of different things, but I was interested in the history of translation and in the philosophy of language, but I didn't think I'm going to do that myself. Then I got approached to do the Seneca translations, which were my first foray into it, and I realized how much I loved it. And I got approached to do that because I'd already written about Seneca in my first book. So I mean, in a way, it was sort of, I'd already marked out that this is an author that I'm really interested in, and therefore I got approached to consider doing it. So I got asked to do the Odyssey, and I really spent a while wondering, do I think there is room in the world for another one? And I'd always loved the Odyssey. I've always loved Homer, and I'd always sort of wanted to go on rereading them, but I wouldn't have done it if I hadn't also felt that there is room to do something different. Because I do think there are some texts that are translated over and over in the exact same way, which I'm not sure how useful that is. I mean, I guess it's fun, but I feel like ideally, if you're going to spend that many years doing a huge project like this, for me personally, it wouldn't feel worth it if I didn't feel I can do something that really is going to feel to me that it's adding something different.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I guess you've already sort of answered this question, but does the text get more or less exciting for you as you translate it?
It gets, I mean, I feel like I've been very lucky. I mean, this maybe is related to the previous question, which is that I've always worked on texts I absolutely love. And so for me, just spending more, with each of the texts I've done, the more time I spend with them, the more exciting they get, the more they seem to open up different layers, and I notice things that I hadn't realized before. And I think that's not just about the translation itself, or the process of translation itself, it's about just spending that many hours just thinking that phrase, how exactly does that phrase work? How does that phrase work? And if I translate it, maybe there are 20 different ways I could do that, which of them gets closest to what I'm hearing in the original. And so that sort of intimate level of living with a text is such a wonderful and rewarding thing. And I mean, if I'd had to translate a text I didn't enjoy or that didn't open up for me in those ways, then maybe it would be, I don't know, maybe I'd find ways to make it fun. But for all the texts that I've done, I have definitely felt that I'm always learning new things, even if when I start the project and sign up to it, I've already, read it and taught it many times. I still every day learn new things about each of these texts. Yeah.
One question is about why you think we need new translations. So partly you've said that if you can do something new with the text, then maybe it's worth doing.
I think if you can do something new and that also feels authentic and that brings the text alive in a different way. I mean, I think there are some wonderful old translations. I mean, the translations of Homer by Pope and his collaborators are really fun, but they're not texts that I would feel I can prescribe to modern undergraduates, and they're also more Pope than Homer. I mean, I felt that in the case of most of the authors I've done, that there was this sort of market hole in terms of translations that are both that feel vivid and alive and clear, and that aren't sort of obscure in willful ways. I mean, I want, as in the passage I just talked about with the weird depiction of gender, I want those lines to be a bit weird and potentially even obscure. Maybe you have to sort of pause and figure out what does that mean. But I want it to be the case in my translations that if there's something weird or slightly obscure, there's a reason for that. Whereas I think there were some translations, there are quite a lot of translations of Greek and Latin texts where they're obscure for no good reason. And so I sort of wanted to try and sort of demonstrate that these texts are alive, they can be very clear and accessible, and if they're difficult, it's an earned kind of difficulty. And then I guess one of the primary things that I want to bring to every verse text I've done is just to make sure the meter is really regular and really audible. I mean, there were so many of the most used translations of Greek tragedy and of Homer, and in both of them, obviously these are performance texts. They're texts to be that were designed for performance out loud, and where in the original the rhythm is extremely obvious and regular, and yet most of the contemporary translations that I found myself reading with students were in free verse or in prose, and I felt like this huge chunk of the experience of the original was missing if you're going to read a translation that's of a verse text or of a poem that doesn't have any element of the sound of rhythmical language. So that, I mean, that's for me one of the motivations, but I don't think that has to be the only reason a translator would do this. I think there could be any number of things that a new translation could bring. And I do think that a translator who's sort of thinking of signing a contract should think about what are your reasons and what are you adding. Just as if you're going to do a new monograph or a new critical study, in the same way, you have to be able to say, this is my fresh take on Euripides. I know that there are 500 books about Euripides already, but this is what mine is bringing to the picture. I think a translator has to do the same sort of thing of having some critical and stylistic and linguistic sort of angles that are going to make the text alive in a new way.
We've got a question about potentially a new offer. Would you consider, after translating the Odyssey and the Iliad, would you consider translating the Aeneid? And if you did, do you think it would be easier or harder than Homer?
I don't think I'm going to do the Aeneid. I adore the Aeneid. I love it so much. It's a wonderful poem. I read it all the time. I love it. I've taught it a bunch of times. I quite like the Sarah Rudin translation, which is in verse, and I think she really does a good job of conveying how dense Virgil's Latin is. I also know of at least one other verse translation that's in the works right now that I think is going to be really good. So maybe this goes back to the previous question of, I would do it only if I felt there was no good metrical verse contemporary translation of the Aeneid out there that does some of the things I might do. Given that I think there are and will soon be even more good verse translations, I'm not sure that I need to do that. I mean, I think I need to be grateful that other people are doing it, and I don't need to do everything. It doesn't always have to be me, you know. Other people do some translating too, you know. I'm not the only translator in the world. But I think the Aeneid would be difficult in very different ways. I mean, the way that the Homeric line is quite aerated, in the sense that it has quite a lot of words which aren't quite fillers, but they almost are, where a lot of the words or a lot of the sounds are particles, and it's this right here, and indeed, and then yes, and then this, and then this. And there's those sort of filler words and the formulae, which sort of let you coast for a minute or two, or take your breath if you're performing it out loud. Virgil doesn't have that. It's just like, it's very, very poetically dense all the time. I mean, I think in a way, I talked about the denseness of Sophoclean verse. I think that question of how can you convey a dense poetic texture would be there a fortiori for Virgil. So I think it would be a different kind of challenge. I mean, obviously, every challenge of that kind is super fun, as long as you love the text.
Yeah, yeah. We've got one last question. Do you worry that the texts are not the original ones, that they've been altered over time in the copying? I personally find this what fascinates me about them. But...
Yes, I think it's super fascinating. Maybe you should answer that one. Do you want to answer that
one? No.
Yes, I mean, I think it's the whole field of textual criticism and the history of classical texts, and the whole attempt by scholars to try to reconstruct whatever we can about what might the original be. And if there's, I mean, in this play, there were several lines that I think probably don't belong in the text, or that may be interpolations of some kind or other. I mean, I think for me, I don't see sort of struggling over the text as my primary job as a translator. I think I do have a responsibility sometimes to add a footnote or say, I haven't translated this line because I don't think it belongs in the text, but this is what it would have said. I do that by footnotes. I think it's a super interesting field of study, and there's a lot to be said about it, and a lot to be said just the fact that these texts have been both reread, recopied, and also reperformed so many times is so interesting, and also leads to different kinds of textual corruption and different kinds of textual error versus texts which haven't been as much performance texts. So I think it's all, I mean, do I worry, or do I think it's kind of cool and interesting? I mean, I think the idea that we can get back to absolutely, 100%, this is what, well, these are the exact words that were spoken in 413 or whichever year we think this play was first performed. I mean, I don't think that we can ever get with 100% certainty back to that. I think, textual scholars do a lot of really important work getting us perhaps closer, but I don't think we can ever get to total certainty that, yes, this is what Euripides meant us to read. But I'm not sure that I see that necessarily as worrying. I see that as an interesting historical and textual challenge.
Yeah, and perhaps that's one of the reasons why they're so rich, because they've been reperformed, as you were saying, they've been reperformed and copied and sort of handed down by so many hands and so many brains that it's now got multiple layers
yes.
of different interpretations. So one last curiosity. So we have touched upon meter, we've touched upon sort of rhythm. What about the performance or performative language, so the theatrical language when you're translating something? Or did you have the stage in mind? Were you thinking about that this particular translation to be staged at some point?
I'm so thrilled of his being staged, yes, and I feel kind of angry that I didn't go to see it, because yes, I'm so happy it's getting performed. I did put in stage directions, which partly, I was told to by the editors, but I would have done that anyway. I certainly wanted to make it a text that could be used for this purpose, to create a performance. and I see sort of writing for the, and I do this with Homer too, but especially with my drama translations, I do a huge amount of sort of reading out loud while I'm working on it, and sort of trying to put on my silly voices and do a little sort of mini performance in my room for myself, just to try and see, does this seem like a line that an actor could reasonably perform? How would this speech land if you were reading it out loud? And I mean, in the case of Euripides, if I found I've got this line that I think will work, and when I read it out loud, I think it's really funny, I felt that's okay. In the case of Homer, if I had too many funny lines, I would try and tweak it. But in the case of Euripides, I felt this is going to work. But then also just try, I mean, as I think about, I mean, as I do my drafts and then change my drafts, I also try to think, I think it's also about writing for the stage, about how the different voices might be different, and about how can I make sure that Electra sounds kind of like she's the same person talking throughout the play. So I certainly think about that kind of thing, and how like what exactly is her voice. I mean, of course, the ancient Greeks didn't know about method acting, but they certainly knew about characterization and about the subtleties of how people interact with each other.
Yeah. Perhaps we do have time for one very last question. So we've got about 5 minutes. Which is about what your opinion is about, as a translator, about such reception pieces like Home Fire or Brother Where Art Thou. Would you consider these a form of translation or something new entirely?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think there's a whole sort of spectrum with sort of translation at one end and then different. I mean, translation is one kind of reception, and of course it's the most intimate kind of reception, because you're receiving ideally every phrase, every sound, every word, every moment. Whereas I know that the Coen brothers boasted that they never read the Odyssey, and they just dipped into a tiny bit of it. And Oh Brother Where Art Thou is obviously not a close reading of the Odyssey and close reading of every word. It's a very different kind of text. It's a fun text, but it's a very different kind of thing. And I mean, Home Fire is also just a really interesting example, because it's so close to Antigone, but I know, I mean, I got to meet Shamsi 2 years ago, something like that. And I know that she's talked about how she wasn't really that familiar with the Antigone before she was asked to do an adaptation of it. And then she realized, oh yes, in fact, I've been writing novels like this all my career. And that this in fact was a sort of culmination for her of themes that she's always been interested in terms of belonging. But I think that approach of being a creative, being a novelist, and having a particular subject you want to write about, which in her case was about the belonging or not belonging of people from South Asia within the US and the UK, and being perceived as terrorists if you're a Muslim, and that kind of issue, which she both wanted to evoke the lived experience of that and trace it through different characters. And it turned out that Antigone enabled her to do that. So that's starting in a different place from the place that I'm starting in, which is, how can I make Euripides Electra mean something? And it might then be that at later points, or as I'm doing the work, I may then also, with part of my mind, be thinking, oh, I know about sibling relationships from my own life, or I have thoughts about how this might relate to what's going on in the news. But that's not going to be at the forefront of my work, certainly not in the forefront of what appears on the page, even if it's maybe bubbling away in the back of my mind. So I definitely see it as these are related endeavors, but they're not absolutely identical. And I would kind of resist the idea that we should use the term translation for all of these forms of reception. I think we should have much more capacious terms for all the different ways that people can engage with classical literature, with literature in general.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much. I don't want to keep you more than I've said we would. So for those of you who are going off to watch the play, I hope you like it. And just to let you know that we are filming tonight's performance. And we will be able to broadcast it in a couple of weeks' time on YouTube. So yeah, if you're interested, we will contact you later on with details about it. So Emily, thank you so much for being with us tonight.
Thank you all. Thank you, Joanna.
And yeah, I hope to see you all at the play. Bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.